everybody. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Isis and this is Isis Says Hi. Hope you're having a great day today. I make videos about topics that matter to me, just depending on what. The world is my oyster. Except for right now, actually. So, I mean it is, but like not. I talk about topics that matter to me, and if not that, I vlog. So, this is actually the last video for Black History Month. So today we're going to be talking about Josiah Henson, and he is kind of known as Uncle Tom, or the inspiration for Uncle Tom from Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. I saw this on the Twitter account that I think I forgot to cite in my last video, so I'm sorry about that, about how the inspiration for Uncle Tom and how Uncle Tom is not what it's known as today, and is actually very different from what we actually know it as. Trigger warnings for a lot of his story. A lot of it includes slavery, of course, and cruelty in that regard, and then also sexual assault. Josiah Henson was born into slavery on June 15th, 1789, and he was born in Charles County, Maryland, on a farm owned by Francis Newman. As a young man, Henson was maimed for life, having an arm and both shoulder blades broken by the white overseer of a neighbor of his master. His first memory was of his father being whipped and having his ear cut off and sold to an Alabama slaveholder, all as punishment for striking a white man who had attempted to rape his wife. He recalls his father falling into a deep depression after he was whipped and his ear cut off, and he was so far removed that no fear or threats of being sold to the far south, the greatest of all terrors to the Maryland slave, would render him tractable. After the death of his owner, Henson was later separated from his mother and siblings. After witnessing the sale of her other children, Henson's mother begged her new owner, Isaac Riley, to purchase the 5-year-old Henson, as well as herself, and spare to her one of her little ones at least. Riley not only ignored her, he beat her into silence. Henson was sold off to a child trafficker. These were Henson's earliest observations of men, which left a bitterness that cannot diminish to any individual who suffers it. Soon, Mr. Henson, as a child, became deathly ill. The slave trader who bought him offered the boy to Henson's mother's owner, so Isaac Riley, and he was an alcoholic gambler. And then he gave him bargain, apparently, free of charge if he died, and if he didn't die, some horseshoeing work if he survived. Unsure of what that means, assuming maybe just cleaning a horse's hooves. I'll probably define that for you. Mr. Henson endured countless beatings as a child, especially after an attempt to learn to read. Yet, he had a great physical strength and leadership ability, and he was also well liked among his associates in misery, which are the other slaves essentially, but he says associates in misery. And eventually it became Riley's market man in the nation's capital, which is in Washington, D.C. He was also named as head of the farm, though Henson did not like his master, describing him as an unprincipled and cruel man. He eventually won Riley's respect and became the farm's overseer, or the manager. And at the markets of Washington and Georgetown, shoppers knew him fondly as Saya or Cy. At age 22, Mr. Henson married. They had 12 children in all, but had 4 while they were enslaved. A lot of kids. Really loved his wife. Riley allowed him to become a preacher in the Methodist Episcopal Church, even though he wouldn't learn to read until later in life. Henson also became a great preacher, memorizing verses and relying on his speech and natural sense of humor to connect with church congregations. As a person in charge of selling all of his master's farm's produce, he also rubbed a lot of good shoulders, or I guess networked with a lot of well-known lawyers and businessmen, and learned the skills of running a business as well. Henson's master falls into debt. Though Henson had served him faithfully for 20 years, he is with those sent to Riley's brother, whose name is Amos, in Kentucky as part of an attempt to manage debts. In a deal, Henson agreed to go if Riley would also allow his wife and children to go with him, and so he directs transport with 18 slaves, and that included his wife and children, from Maryland to Kentucky. While passing through the free state of Ohio, colored people gathered round us and urged us with much importunity to remain with them, but Henson refused. Even though he desires freedom, he wants to purchase it and will not consider running away because it violates his sense of honor. In the years following, he would regret this decision. So Mr. Henson delivers everyone to their new master, Amos Riley, who is the brother of Isaac Riley. Mr. Henson reflects upon this incident many years after escaping to the north with a view altered by his later experiences. I've often had painful doubts as to the propriety of my carrying so many other individuals into slavery again, and my consoling reflection has been that I acted as I thought at the time was best. Working under Amos Riley, Henson still desired to purchase his freedom. Encouraged by a white Methodist preacher, Henson gets permission to travel to Maryland and visit his old master. And while he's traveling there, he raises money by preaching along the way. He stopped in Ohio first, where he had the opportunity to preach in Methodist circles for donations. What had affected him most was experiencing life in the Free State again. Everywhere I met was with kindness. When he finally arrived, Maryland reunited with Riley. His polite manner irritated him, and Mr. Henson says, "The clothes I wore were certainly better than his." Henson offered all of his money that he had gotten from his life savings to him tripping along to get to him in exchange for his freedom, and I think his family's freedom as well. And Riley agreed. He agrees to a price of $450, which was $100 more than the $350 he had brought. Isaac Riley took the $350 as like a down payment for his freedom. And to, honor this, a note was drawn up stating that after paying that $100, Henson would no longer be Riley's property. But Isaac Riley is actually surprised that Henson was able to earn $350, which is way more at the time. Mr. Henson still couldn't read, and he also didn't see the note as well. And so he didn't see that the note actually added an extra zero. So instead it was $1450, not $450 like Isaac Riley had said. And this kind of led him to be really sad, and he felt like he had no hope. But then even worse, Isaac Riley and Amos Riley had planned to sell him south, so deeper into the south, I think it was New Orleans, to punish him for doing that. I think this was during the trip of him about to be sold. Amos Riley's son, who was supervising him being sold, I'm assuming, or traveling down south to be sold. Mr. Henson nursed him back to health and then returns back to the home with the son alive. Instead of gratitude for saving his son, Henson discovers that the Riley brothers raised the price. After that, Mr. Henson decided to escape with his wife and 4 children, and they walk, Henson carrying the 2 smallest children in a bag on his back, from Kentucky to Ohio, fighting exposure, exhaustion, and hunger. They traveled at night, making stops to sleep and beg for food. And in Ohio, again, Henson reunited with his old friends. They helped them along the way. They even came across a tribe of American Indians who feasted with them, and they spent the night in their camp. When they reached the Niagara River, a kind Scottish captain paid to send the Henson family across, and they finally reached Upper Canada on the 28th of October in 1830. According to one edition of Henson's Autobiography, the captain asked if Henson would be a good man in his new land, and Henson replied, "Yes, I'll use my freedom well. My feet first touched the Canada shore. I threw myself on the ground, rolled in the sand, seized handfuls of it, and danced round till, in the eyes of several who were present, I passed for a madman." When someone questioned his behavior, Henson beamed or smiled. "Don't you know? I'm free." So we talked about how he was able to travel to Canada with his family, and Henson actually finds work on the farm of Mr. Hibbard. There he restarts his preaching, and his oldest son Tom attends school. Mr. Henson is proud of his son's learning, and it creates a moment of crisis and growth for him as well. He describes a pivotal moment where he admits to his son that he cannot read the Bible. Tom offers to teach his father to read. This is another excerpt from his book. "I was delighted with the conviction that my children would have advantages I had never enjoyed. But it was no slight mortification to think of being instructed by a child of 12 years old. Yet ambition and a true desire to learn for the good it would do my own mind conquered the shame." 4 years later, in 1834, he moved with his friends to Colchester and set up a black settlement on rented land. A little after their arrival, the group was freed from the rent because of a mistake in the way that they portioned the land. The original plan was to only be there for a short time, but after that that happened, they stayed there for 7 years. He was then able to purchase 200 acres in Don Township near Dresden in Kent County. With this settlement, his goal was to employ and educate farmer slaves. That is called the Don Settlement. And so that Don Settlement prospered, and at its peak, it had about 500 people within the settlement and was known as a model community for former slaves. It was also one of the final stops on the Underground Railroad. While at the Don Settlement, he met Hiram Wilson, the missionary sent by the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1836 to minister to Canadian black folks. There, he was aided financially by Wilson's friend, James Cannings Fuller, and he was a Quaker donor of Needles, New York. I don't know what that is. I'll put it on the screen, and feel free for anybody who lives there to roast me about it. Henson decided to establish a more formal black community for fugitive slaves where they could prove their capacity for freedom. To back up what I just said, worked for Mr. Hibbard, met Hiram Wilson. While he was in Colchester, he met Hiram Wilson and James Cannings Fuller, and with their money, he was able to purchase 200 acres in the Don Township, which is known as the Don Settlement. I mixed it up in my notes, my bad. And then he also purchased another 200 acres next to it for his family. And the British American Institute was a manual labor school for students of all ages. Throughout Don's existence, the British American Institute remained its main focus, and the intent of this industrial school was to also be a protection for escaped slaves. In addition to the school, Mr. Henson ran a farm, started a grist mill, bred horses, built a sawmill for high-quality black lumber, which was so good that he actually won a medal at the first World's Fair in London 10 years later. Before the Civil War, Mr. Henson traveled between Ontario and Boston, where he usually preached. And during that trip, Mr. Henson befriended the abolitionist Samuel Atkins Eliot, who was a former Boston mayor and state legislator, and would then serve on the U.S. House of Representatives later on. Until 1868, Henson served on the Institute's executive committee, and that not only directed the school, but did the farms as well, the gristmill, the sawmill, the brickyard, and the rope walk. All that Mr. Henson helped to kind of create and aid. Even though he served on such a high committee, he was never the community's official administrative head, and that was a role that was always filled by a white man. So first it was Hiram Wilson, then it was Samuel H. Davis of the American Baptist Free Mission Society, and finally John Scobell, a former secretary of the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. Even though he wasn't the administrative head, he was seen as the head and the spokesperson. He raised a lot of funds by touring the United States and Great Britain, and in 1851 he was granted a personal audience with Queen Victoria. So going back to the Don Settlement, Mr. Henson, as much as he was involved in getting money for the Don Settlement and the British American Institute, he was also involved in a lot of the internal conflict and investigations that was trying to figure out if the British American Institute was actually effective and if they were handling their money well. So in 1845, William P. Newman was appointed the secretary of the executive committee to reorganize management, and he soon charged the committee, which included Mr. Henson, with the bad administration of the settlement. 2 years later, a Negro convention at Drummondville, which is now part of Niagara Falls in Ontario, cleared Mr. Henson of that wrongdoing, so they said that he wasn't at fault. In 1848, the trustees of the British American Institute determined the whole executive committee, which included Mr. Henson, as unfit to direct the activities of the school. Investigations into Britain in 1849 and 1852 produced those same results and increased a lot of doubts about Mr. Henson. Mr. Henson was seen as kind of like the leader of this place because, again, he was a spokesperson. He went out to get money for the settlement, to get money for the school. There was a failed attempt to rule Britain Institute by the committee, the executive committee, that was created outside of Mr. Henson from 1847 to 1850. John Scobell increasingly argued with Mr. Henson over property sales, and in later lawsuits, Scobell was found to win those arguments. And in 1868, when the institute closed and after Scobell had left Don, the money from the school was used to create the Wilberforce Educational Institute in Chatham, and the Don settlement later died out, and Henson, though he stayed in Dresden until his death, had lost his role as a black leader. So earlier I did talk about his autobiography, and I talked about somebody named Samuel Atkins Eliot. And now we're coming up to where he would be a little bit involved. So impressed with Mr. Henson, Samuel Atkins Eliot offered to write the story of his life as a biography, and that book is titled The Life of Josiah Henson, formerly a slave, now an inhabitant of Canada, as narrated by himself, and that was published in early 1849. Henson's book got attention at the abolitionist reading room in Boston and in similar households throughout the North. On one of his trips home from Boston, Henson took a detour to visit a woman who was about to write a book of her own. In a later edition of Henson's memoir, he recalls, "I was in the vicinity of Andover, Massachusetts in the year 1849, where Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe resided. She sent for me and my traveling companion, Mr. George Clark, a white gentleman who had a fine voice for singing and usually sang at my meetings to add to their interest. We went to Mrs. Stowe's house. She was deeply interested in the story of my life and misfortunes and had me narrate its details to her. She said she was glad it had been published and hoped it would be of great service and would open the eyes of the people to the enormity of the crime of holding men in bondage. She manifested so much interest in me that I told her about the peculiarities of many slaveholders and the slaves in the region where I had lived for 42 years. My experiences had been more varied than those of the majority of slaves." So Mr. Henson's autobiography is widely believed to be the model for Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, specifically Uncle Tom. And because of the success of Stowe's novel, Henson actually expanded his own life story in an 1858 work titled Truth Stranger Than Fiction, Father Henson's Story of His Own Life. So now we're going to talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'm laughing because I just tried to say that and I very much messed it up. In March 1851, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote to Gamaliel Bailey, who was the editor and publisher of the National Era, a Washington anti-slavery paper, and offered him the story she had been working on, which she thought would run for about 3 or 4 parts. The story details the journeys of 2 enslaved laborers on the edge of being sold off by their owner, Kentucky farmer in debt. One named Harry flees with his mother Eliza to the north, eventually ending up in Canada, while the other, Uncle Tom, is transported down to the Mississippi River, where he is eventually sold to a cruel plantation owner. Tom's faith nearly fades, but a pair of visions place him back on firm ground. After encouraging 2 women to escape north, Tom is beaten to death when he refuses to reveal where they've gone, and an attempt by Tom's original owner to purchase Tom back arrives too late. When returning to Kentucky, the farmer's son sets all of his dead fathers enslaved free, encouraging them to remember Tom's sacrifice whenever they see his cabin. This story was called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin premiered in the National Era on June 5th, 1851, and it ran in 41 weekly papers over 10 months. It quickly grabbed DC's attention, and the paper's subscriber base grew by about 26%, and about 50,000 people read Stowe's story, urging John P. Jewett and Company to publish it as a novel in 2 volumes of 312 pages each. Soon, 17 printing presses were running around the clock to keep up with demand. By the end of its first year in print, the book had sold more than 300,000 copies in the US alone and another million in Great Britain. It went on to become the best-selling novel of the 19th century. Josiah Henson wrote of the release. When this novel of Mrs. Stowe came out, it shook the foundations of this world. It shook Americans out of their shoes and of their shirts. It left some of them on the sandbar barefooted and scratching their heads, so they came to the conclusion that the whole thing was a fabrication. Post-slavery advocates saw the novel as propaganda, which is like something to kind of like promote like a certain political idea. Critics argued that Stowe's writing was too emotional to be real. After all, it was a novel. It wasn't based on facts, they said. Pro-slavery papers were mocking and sarcastic in their reviews. Some said she overlooked the many benefits of slavery, including romantic love between an enslaved woman and her master. So we're going to talk about the first one, right? The benefit of slavery is that you get to exploit people till they die for money. That's capitalism. Second, romantic love between an enslaved woman and her master. I hate saying Stockholm Syndrome because I now know that it's a pretty sexist term, but that's the example of that. An enslaved person is not going to reject like any kind of flirtation with a master. And as as maybe authentic as it might be, there is still that dynamic that exists, meaning that an enslaved person is going to do whatever they can for survival. If they were to reject that, they would either be forced to accept it, or they would die, or get sold to somebody who they know is way crueler. If we're gonna base it off of those two ideals, they're pretty bad. Rather than letting the media and propagandist anti-Tom novels gain attention and discredit the truths in her novel, Mrs. Stowe said receipts. She published in early 1853 a book called The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, presenting original facts and documents upon which the story is founded, together with corroborative statements verifying the truth of the work. This was a giant annotated catalog of her sources, and the book pointed to hundreds of documented cases of real-life incidents that were similar or identical to those portrayed in her story. Stowe had named names. She had described the various people who had inspired the stories of Mr. Haley, George Harris, Eliza, Simon Legree, and the rest. And one of those characters was of particular interest. Who was Uncle Tom? Stowe wrote in The Key, "The character of Uncle Tom has been objected to as improbable, and yet the writer has received more confirmations of that character from a great variety of sources than any other in the book." Stowe spent many pages describing the inspiration for various seeds in Uncle Tom's story, and then she declares, "A last instance parallel without of Uncle Tom is to be found in the published memoirs of the Venerable Josiah Henson, now pastor of the missionary settlement at Dawn in Canada." There were big overlaps between the lives of Josiah Henson and Tom. Readers who knew Mr. Henson's story immediately saw them. On April 15th, 1853, Martin Robison Delaney, one of the first 3 black men admitted to Harvard Medical School, and the only black officer who received the rank of major during the Civil War, wrote a letter to Frederick Douglass in which he confirmed Stowe's opinion of Josiah. He wrote, "It is now certain the Reverend Josiah Henson of Dawn, Canada West, is the real Uncle Tom, the Christian hero in Mrs. Stowe's far-famed book of Uncle Tom's Cabin." Mr. Delaney also suggested to Douglass that perhaps, since Stowe owed Josiah something more than a citation in her book, since Mrs. Stowe and Messrs. Jewett and Cole, publishers, have realized so great an amount of money from the sale of a work founded upon this good old man, whose living testimony has to be brought to sustain this great book, who would it be expecting too much that they, the publishers, present Father Henson but a portion of the profits? I do not know what you may think about it, but it strikes me that this would be just and right. According to the Library of Congress's circulation records, so just keeps track of what books come out of the library and go back in, President Abraham Lincoln borrowed The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin on June 16, 1862, and returned it 43 days later, on July 29th. The dates match at the time that he drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. While it isn't clearly said that the book influenced Abraham Lincoln, it's clear that this book, as well as Miss Stowe, used her celebrity platform to powerfully sway public opinion towards emancipation. His Republican Party had distributed 100,000 copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin during the presidential campaign of 1860 as a way to increase abolitionist support. Without the abolitionist press and Stowe's book, it's possible that Lincoln would not have gotten enough support to be elected president. And thanks to the success of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Mr. Henson's achievement became common knowledge. Though he still referred to himself as the real Uncle Tom, he became a famous activist in his own right. He republished his memoir and used the funds to purchase his brother's freedom. He supported black families whose husbands and fathers went to fight in the Civil War. He ran businesses in Canada to employ black refugees. In 1876, at age 87, Henson did a 100-plus city-speaking tour of the United Kingdom to relieve himself of debt due to the work at the Dawn settlement and the legal battle with Scobell that he lost. Queen Victoria invited him to the Windsor Castle, as we talked about before. 16 years after the Civil War ended, Rutherford B. Hayes, which is kind of surprising because I'm pretty sure he was racist, invited him to the White House. When paying tribute to the man who inspired her most famous character, Stowe wrote that no person's story was more striking, more characteristic, and instructive than that of Josiah Henson. Then you should have paid him. Mr. Henson just wanted a better, fairer world. My task is done. If what I have written shall inspire a deeper interest in my race and shall lead to corresponding activity in their behalf, I shall feel amply repaid. The British Prime Minister Lord John Russell threw him a surprise banquet. The Archbishop of Canterbury wept after hearing his story. Mr. Henson repeatedly returned to the US, and as I said before, he guided 118 other slaves to freedom. After Stowe published The Key and identified Henson, his supporters rebranded him the real Uncle Tom, and it was a good thing at the time. But today, Uncle Tom has a derogatory meaning due to its bastardization at the hands of racist black-faced playwrights in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For more than 40 years after his death, Blackface Tom shows played within half a mile of Henson's grave, and within a generation, his story was nearly lost. Josiah Henson died in Dresden, Ontario in 1883 at the age of 93. His funeral was one of the largest in Dresden's history. Bells rang from churches, and most of the businesses closed for the service. Black musicians performed hymns, and 50 wagons followed his casket in a nearly 2-mile procession to the graveside. Thousands of black and white attendees paid their respects. Mr. Henson's cabin in Dresden is now a small museum, and more than 200 of his descendants are still alive today. His legacy continues through his descendants, who include Arctic explorer Matthew Henson, who I was going to talk about this month, an Oscar-nominated actor, Taraji P. Henson, which is freaking amazing, and the 100-strong family reunion that takes place every summer, rotating between Michigan, Ontario, and Maryland. Mr. Henson never received a dime from Stowe's publishers. The village of Dresden is still home to hundreds of descendants of enslaved laborers, men and women who first settled in the area as fugitives in Josiah Henson's time. Mr. Henson is honored by Canada with the plaques that they have displayed around his cabin, the famous Tom's Cabin, located near the Don settlement. And Mr. Henson is also the first black person to be featured on a Canadian stamp. The Riley Bolton House, which was once the home of Isaac Riley, this is my favorite part by the way, is part of a 1.43-acre park property now named for Josiah Henson, locally known as Uncle Tom's Cabin. It has been open to visitors since 2006 when it was purchased by Montgomery Parks as a historic site and museum. In January, I don't know if it was of this year or last year, the county announced plans to redevelop the site into a major new museum celebrating the author and activist, and hoping to spread awareness of his story. On his tombstone, it reads, "After escaping to Upper Canada from slavery in Kentucky, the Reverend Josiah Henson became a conductor of the Underground Railroad and a force in the abolition movement. The founder of the black settlement of Don, he was also an entrepreneur and established a school, the British American Institute. His fame grew after Harriet Beecher Stowe stated that his memoirs, published in 1849, had provided conceptions and incidents for her extraordinarily popular novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Henson's celebrity raised international awareness of Canada as a haven for refugees from slavery." And that's it. Uncle Tom might not be what we think it was. All of the places where I got my research from are listed down below. And yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Bye!